The Age of Enlightenment was nothing short of a revolution in how the West saw the world. It brought new ideas and new approaches to science, philosophy, and art. At that time, the major Western nations had colonies all over the world, and when the interest of the West was drawn to fallen civilizations, museums funneled a lot of money into archaeological excavations to ensure the acquisition of high-quality objects. In many cases, the country of origin got half of the finds, and the museums or private collectors got the other half. Some of the objects from the early acquisitions are still the subject of debates that have gone on for centuries with no end in sight. Other cases have been successfully resolved, resulting in the repatriation of disputed objects. Still others remain unsolved, such as in the case of the bust of Nefertiti that has been resting in the Neues Museum in Berlin for over a century.
With Nefertiti, it was the period of partage of objects. And of course, Nefertiti, there are these myths that Nefertiti was covered with clay and in a dark room, in a box hidden by the Germans. They cheated the Egyptians. I mean, when you know the reality, and we passed the documentation to the Egyptian authorities several times, and you see that before they met to organize the partage, to decide about the partage, the German excavators had to make a complete list of all the objects, and from the better objects, they had to hand over to the Egyptian authorities photos. There was about a dozen of photos from Nefertiti, from the bust of Nefertiti. So the Egyptian knew perfectly what has to be treated. But Nefertiti at that time was considered, of course, a wonderful bust of an Egyptian queen, but had not the importance and the hype which Nefertiti has today. And the Egyptians have been keen on a very other important object. So the partage was done, and that's it.
Even if the Germans believed that it was legal to have our part of the excavation and leave the Egyptians the other part, the law said that only double objects would be divided and unique objects would remain in Egypt. Well, where is the copy of Nefertiti that was supposed to be left in Egypt? Egyptology started as a Western discipline. Unfortunately, it has remained a Western discipline. All publications, coffee table books, are written in English, French, German, sometimes in Italian. But very little is written in Arabic. So how can we ask people to appreciate a culture that they have no access to the knowledge of it? With the previous regime of Mubarak, he would forbid Egyptians from going to archaeological sites, and particularly the Giza pyramids, on feast days, because the government saw that the Egyptians are a nuisance to the tourists. So we cannot ask people who have always been walled off, who has always been seen as a nuisance on archaeological sites close to the tourists. We've always just seen the archaeological space as a space for the foreign tourists and the foreign archaeologists, sending the regular Egyptian a message that this is not yours. So I believe that this completely needs to change. And I believe we'll find more Egyptians embracing ancient Egypt if they just have access to the culture.
In the 19th, early 20th century, it was a colonial past. And of course, people have not been on the same level. There have been differences in power. This is ridiculous to neglect that. But the other question is, what would have happened to many of the objects if Europeans would not have started to be interested in this kind of collections, to be interested in this kind of archaeological research, to be interested in making this cultural heritage survive. At that time, in many of these countries, there was no archaeological service. So the history is not only black and white, it's very complicated.
I first saw Nefertiti in 2007 when I went for a short training in Martin Gropius Bau Museum in Berlin. And I remember that as soon as I landed, the first thing I wanted to do, even before going to my hotel, is to just go see Nefertiti. Because I come from Middle Egypt, the exact same village of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. So in a way, I had a very strong connection to it, not just because I was an Egyptologist, but because I come from Minya. I saw Nefertiti in this huge room in the museum, this glass box, and I just felt that she was very lonely.
One thing has to be made clear: the government of Egypt never officially claimed the return of Nefertiti. This is one position. And the other position was that we had now several Egyptian ambassadors in Berlin, in Germany. They say, well, Nefertiti is the best public relation, the best propaganda for Egyptian culture, Egyptian history in Germany.
Während des Krieges wurden die berühmtesten Kunstwerke aus den deutschen Museen entfernt und im Lande verstreut. Im Landesmuseum Wiesbaden wurde eine Ausstellung solcher geretteter Kunstwerke eröffnet, deren Wert auf 10 Millionen Dollar geschätzt wird. Das berühmteste Stück der Ausstellung ist der Kopf der ägyptischen Königin Nefertiti aus dem Jahre 1370 vor Christus. Die Büste stand früher im Berliner Pergamonmuseum. Sie galt lange als verschollen und wurde schließlich in einem Salzbergwerk in Mitteldeutschland aufgefunden.
I went back to Berlin for my postdoc, and I stayed there for 2 years, where it was just right post the Egyptian Revolution. And I remember how we used to paint Nefertiti's face as part of the struggle of Egyptian women that were fighting many of the fundamentalist ideas back then. Even if Borchardt has taken her by saying that she's a regular gypsum bust. And in a way, he managed to get it out in a not very correct way. She has remained a symbol and an icon for ancient Egyptian women, regardless.
The bust of Nefertiti is closely guarded, and absolutely no photography is allowed, as the museum holds all rights for the bust. Hand-painted replicas of the Nefertiti bust were recently produced by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. Price tag, €8,900. In 2016, Berlin-based artists Jan Nicolai Nellis and Nora Al-Badri clandestinely 3D scanned the bust of Nefertiti in Neues Museum and released the data to the general public as an act of artistic intervention.
So why we choose Nefertiti? We assume that this is it's an icon with its own social power. So it's more like it does represent more the others of millions of looted and stolen objects, which are now located in the museums in the global north. But actually the vast majority of those objects, be it antiquities and artifacts, are originally from the global south. The scanning process took just 1 day, but the whole project, the preparation, until we finished it took us 1 year, and we had 2 lawyers even to protect us. Because what the museum did, and this is to us showing how serious it actually is, but also how necessary that kind of public discourse around those objects and the ownership of those digital objects is, they were threatening to sue us in an interview where an article in the New York Times was. And so we were like really happy about it.
When we heard about this not very legal scanning of Nefertiti, my first reaction was, when was it done? Why nobody was aware about this? And of course it showed which technical possibilities modern devices can offer you. but that's it. I mean, on the other hand, Nefertiti is nothing secret. There are millions of photos and videos in internet. I mean, it's fine. Meanwhile, it is not really doing damage, and we are very scary with lightning and things like that. So what can you do? I mean, it's not the way how things should be done.
We thought it's a challenge, and we like to challenge ourselves how we can get our hands on this bust.
The artists used a hacked version of a Kinect, a motion-sensing device used with Xbox gaming consoles, to secretly scan the closely guarded bust of Nefertiti.
We had to figure out how to circulate the object and not be seen by anybody. So we put the scanner on Nora underneath her scarf. But these constant guards, they're changing position in around like 50 degrees around Nefertiti. They're doing this the whole day. So they have their customs how to deal. We observed them, and so we figured out how they move. But if you take your cell phone out, they immediately shout at you, "Oh, no photo!" Or, they're quite good on this, but nobody expects a scanner under a scarf, so we have the advantage of surprise in this case. And this builds part of the data set we have today. But the other part of the data comes from an unknown source.
After making a copy of the Nefertiti bust, the artists traveled to Egypt, where they buried it in the desert in an act of artistic repatriation.
By stealing her digitally and repatriating her physically to Egypt as a copy, we also question the term of if there is just one original, or if the decontextualization happens by the museum and by the collectors putting these artifacts away from their context into a museum's context, and then it becomes an asset. You can possess these objects. They have no utility value. Their cultural purpose has gone.
So I believe there should be a wider discourse. Most academics who are in the field and administrators, they just want to hush the discourse. They don't want to discuss it. So it's no. It's a no. Even on both sides, it's a useless case. The West, either they have it, black or white. Either the West should have it or the West should not have it. There is really no meaningful discourse between both parties. So I believe these voices should be heard. And you know, today with the modern technologies and the virtual reality and the replicas and the 3D printing and all this technology, I mean, would not stand really, I think, in the face of finding solutions for this. Like, for example, I feel very bad every time I go to the Dendera temple and the Zodiac is in the Louvre in Paris, and we just have a very nasty replica of it. So this is part of the temple. So we should really be more inventive about how we can deal with things. And also many of these museums, they have archaeological missions working in Egypt. So they have interests in continuing their work in Egypt.
It's a central task for museums for the future, for still many, many years, to digitize all the items they have, the complete collections, to make it accessible and so on. But the original never can be replaced by a video, something completely different. It's emotion, it's the aura of an object, or music or art. So this is what counts.
these aftermaths, we were invited by several museums to talk on these topics. And in one particular museum, which I won't name now, they were coming up to us afterwards in the dinner and were asking us, hey, do you think it's possible you can hack us too? We want to be hacked by you and we will give you some data as well. And we were looking at each other and were saying, no, but this, like this, it doesn't work, like for us not.
Following the release of the data, a debate ensued about whether this was a hack or just an elaborate hoax.
There was a big discussion whether our scanning was true or not. And I mean, we launched the video in order to prove that we were actually in the museum with this hacked Kinect. It's an amazing device which can do a lot of things if you hack it. We were there and we scanned the object, and the only question we which until today remains open, is whether the data set was purely from our scanning or not. And of course, I mean, it can be also a server hack. It can be an inside job. It could have been the cleaner, or it could have also been just a copy scan and put everything together. Yet the data set is amazing, and actually when you 3D print it, and like we exhibited it in Cairo, you see even more things than on the real object because it's not painted, and you can see all details, which is amazing. Yeah.
Iceland was occupied by Britain and the USA during World War II. As Denmark was occupied by Germany, Iceland severed ties with Denmark in 1944, after having been a Danish colony for several centuries. One of Iceland's first demands to Denmark was the return of the Icelandic medieval manuscripts that had been shipped to Copenhagen in the 17th and 18th centuries.
The Icelandic medieval manuscripts written in the Middle Ages were preserved into the 17th century, and at that point in time they were being replaced by paper and printing. And of course Iceland was part of the Danish kingdom at that point, and the capital of the country was in Copenhagen, and learned people in Copenhagen, and also Icelanders that were there, became aware of the importance of bringing them to Copenhagen to preserve them and also use them to write the history of Scandinavia, because they were the unique sources. And so they became brought out of the country in the 17th and 18th century, some of them just in fragments, but most of them were taken to Copenhagen, to the Arne Magnusson collection. Icelander, who became professor at the Copenhagen University, was the main collector of manuscripts in the 17th and 18th century. A unique achievement, and he brought about 3,000 manuscripts or fragments to Copenhagen into his private collection. And when he died, and of course he suffered a great loss just before he died, the burning of Copenhagen in 1728, part of his collection was caught in the fire, but most of it, they managed to bring most of the vellums or the parchment books out, so they were taken into security. But when he died, he endowed his collection to the Copenhagen University, which of course was Iceland's university as well. And so the manuscript remained in Denmark. But when we gained our independence in 1944, a long time later, this was our first, if you like, demand on Denmark that they would bring back the manuscript, because this was our heritage. These were in fact books written in Iceland by Icelandic culture, even though the content matter was of course, common to the north. And this took some decades to debate between the countries. Very interesting debate on a high level of government level from the beginning, from 1944 till 1971, when the first manuscript were brought back. And this was, of course, not an easy or simple matter. It was a great complex matter in Denmark, because bringing out something owned by the government or by the state is, of course, not done lightly, and you have to change the laws to allow that to happen.
The first phase of returning the medieval manuscripts to Iceland took place in 1971, when two of the most prized books were handed over. A large crowd gathered at the port, and there were celebrations all over Iceland. Many Icelanders interpreted this as a watershed moment in restoring the dignity of the young republic.
Because this was a very complex issue in Denmark. You cannot give away the property of the state. It's very complex. That was the initial idea, that they would return and give half of the collection back to Iceland. So it was owned by us and owned by Denmark. But it was a legal issue, very complex one. It was not possible. So by law, the collection is still owned by Denmark, but we take care of it, or we preserve our part. And of course, it's bound in law in both countries. So it's, of course, de facto, we think we own the manuscripts. Of course, we own it by sort of, you could say, spiritually, but legally, it's still owned by Denmark. But this is not a big issue, because this was just to take the manuscript back, to bring them back physically, is of course the main thing. And now, of course, having them back, we can of course display them. We have access to them. So the actual to have them in our country is the most important thing. Ownership is not always the most important thing, because we own it all together.
The National Museum of Denmark was established in the early 1800s. It is Denmark's largest museum of cultural history, covering both Danish and foreign cultures. In its collection are parts of the disputed Parthenon marbles from Athens, as well as objects from former colonies and the autonomous countries within the Kingdom of Denmark, such as the Faroe Islands and Greenland.
We are a very old museum. We have more than 200 years, and the question of repatriation have been a part of being a national museum. So, for example, our founder, Christian Jørgensen, even though he had already in the beginning, he had some objects from Flensborg, where with the new borders, we send something back to Flensborg, because they requested. So we did it already in the beginning of the Museum of the History. And now occasionally we get, of course, sometimes just questions, and sometimes, they ask if we can return objects. For example, some years ago we had from Maori people would like to have one of our Maori heads back. And we did that because we think we had a discussion if that was, is there an institution we can deliver that? What is the claiming? By what reasons? And we take it case by case. And sometimes this case we said, okay, let's return the head. And sometimes, it can be for different matters. We need to say no, because for instance, if we can't deliver it to somebody, it can be some indigenous people who just, would like to know more about them, but they don't have any institution. And then, they can ask. And then we would prefer to have maybe digital returns where we can share our collections and they can easily access them. by their own hand. But maybe it doesn't make sense, to deliver the concrete or the physical objects home. We had also Icelandic things in the National Museum, but that was already in 1928 that we repatriated a lot of objects to the Icelandic Museum. So I know for the manuscript that was something with particular feelings for the Icelandic people, but it was not our collection. So I just, from my point of view as a curator, you can see how strong objects can be. I heard that it was more than half of the population in Iceland welcoming this manuscript, so it was hugely important. And for that reason, I think it was a very nice case that material culture matters. And it's a celebration of how important museums and historical objects can be. So for that reason, I think it's actually celebrating the importance of how important physical objects can be as a way of rebuilding a nation, for example, or sharing memories. There was discussion, of course, because it's also a part of our history. We shared the old Nordic worlds and the stories very important for Danish people as well. But for you, it was obviously even more important. So I think it's placed on the right place right now.
So it took a very long debate in the parliament to make it happen. It was very interesting how the debate in Denmark sort of developed from bottom up, if you like. That it was just a request on part of the Icelandic people to get back their own, in a sense, heritage. But we did not get all of it back because in Denmark, of course, they had taken very good care of the manuscript. They had been publishing and editing them and had a academic environment around them. So the end solution, and a very interesting one, a unique one, if you like, on the international level, was to share the manuscripts between the two countries. So we got about half of the manuscripts back to Iceland, and half of them still remains in Copenhagen. And we have, of course, a very strong and fruitful collaboration between the countries. Now the Árni Magnússon collection has been enlisted on the UNESCO Memory of the World list because it's one of those most important collections, documentary heritage in the world. And it's acknowledged that it is shared by both Denmark now and Iceland, even though they, of course, stress that this is the Icelandic manuscript that make up the most of that collection. So this is a unique, I think, testament of how two countries, of course, we are part of the we have a common heritage, we have a common history, could debate a very complex issue because it's about bringing back something that had, of course, been in Copenhagen for 200 years, bring it back to, we say, to their rightful owners. But still share it, and still, because we think about it in a different way nowadays. Now we are, of course, in a sense, unifying the collection again in the digital world. We are digitalizing the manuscript. So it's not maybe the main point where it is, but we have to use it, we have to share it, we have to make other people want to read the manuscript, not just because we own them, because we want to share them. And of course, the UNESCO acknowledgements was acknowledging that this was a heritage of the world. So now it's our duty and the Danish duty to share it, not in the north, just everywhere.
The delivery of the manuscripts ended in 1997. With the successful release of the manuscripts, animosity towards the Danes, for the most part, disappeared. The manuscript issue created a precedent for other nations trying to get their own cultural artifacts out of the hands of former colonial rulers.
We have, with the Greenlandic National Museum, we have this huge process where they would like to have their own national museum in Greenland, and we totally agree, and a lot of the objects were placed in Denmark at our museum. And then we, for 20 years, we have just people, curators, people who know a lot about these collections, and they have this discussion in common. How should we share our common collection? Because it's an important part, of course, of the Greenland story, but it's also an important part of our story in Denmark because we have these strong mutual connections with each other.
Denmark completed the return of 35,000 Greenlandic objects in 2001. The process was called Utimut, a Greenlandic word that means homecoming, and took place over 2 decades. Artifacts were returned, as well as collected information from archaeological sites. This Greenland and Iceland model of return has the potential of being applicable in other parts of the world, where indigenous cultures are facing the fact that their cultural treasures are to be found in the custody of their former overlords.
And then now we have shared our collection, so 35,000 objects actually returned to Greenland. And one of the important part of that, I think, was that the politicians, they were just, they didn't interfere. They just said, that would be nice. Please, would you find out your 2 museums? And then it was, a purely historian discussion with each other. How should we share them? We can just share. We are professional institutions. So I think that's nice. And then maybe other countries can, do the same. But you need, the politicians not to just to step one back because, sometimes they have very strong opinion and sometimes it's more for a very short term that's important for their career, but maybe it's not so important for, a more long perspective. There have been some saying that if we first start to repatriate, then, there will be a floodgate of other Christians. But I think our story at least shows that it had been, as I told in the beginning, it's been part of the National Museum. We were not maybe 10 years old, in the beginning of the 19th century, and they were asked, please, would you deliver some objects back to Germany? And we said yes. And there were no flood, effect. And we have been asking that occasionally, and we answered that. So I think that, of course, it's the right of the time to have this question, have this debate, and I'm welcoming it, actually, because it always shows that we are important as museums. It's really matter, the physical objects, that we can access them and that we can see them, and that is a part of our story. So I don't think that there should be particular some new situation where objects suddenly, there would be a lot of demand suddenly. They are there, and it's always been part of the museum history that we have this discussion where should we place the objects, because objects have several layers of stories inherent in them.
Well, I think the role of encyclopedic, or as we also say, universal museums is more important than ever. They've been created basically in the 19th century, when collecting was going out of Europe, and cultural heritage, art, from archaeology to ethnographic collections to art collections have been gathered in the great centers in Europe, Paris, London, Petersburg, and also Berlin, and also a little bit later in New York in the Metropolitan Museum. These are these 5, I would say, most important places, cities with universal or encyclopedic museums. But now we have a completely changed situation because the world is globalized. Not only in London and Paris and New York, but also in Berlin, there are living people from all over the world. We are receiving refugees, a large number of refugees from Iraq and Syria. And of course, it gets more and more important to offer these people also their cultural relics. And we realized that the Berliners, or the people from Germany, they have to be confronted with other cultures. They have to understand the cultural development in other continents. And when we receive these refugees from the Near East, they are astonished when they see, well, we have collections here from the Islamic world, from Syria. They say, how did these things come here to Berlin? And the second step is, well, they say, it's good that they are here, otherwise it would be destroyed perhaps if they remained in Syria or in Iraq. And then in a next step, they understand, and this is the nice issue of universal encyclopedic museums, when we work with them, because we have a program to train them as museum guides. And after some time, they understand, well, the basic reason why these collections from Syria, Iraq are here, because they are part of a universal picture of the world. And you can compare, you can understand how the Islamic art, for example, emerged from the ancient antiquity, from the Byzantine art. You understand relations to other continents, to other cultures. You understand why men in this part of the world developed in that way and in other parts of the world in this way. And I mean, this really confrontation with the world is very much important.
Every museum is actually a global museum. And the old museum like ours, at the National Museum in Copenhagen, it reflects that we are a connected world. So, of course, there are some dark chapters in the history. That's a part of maybe we have a relation where it's been a part of a colonization or something like that. But it's still a shared history. We can't erase it by, returning the object. We need to cope with that black chapter of our history.
Aims is and was and motivations to decolonize those museums' collections, because we believe in cultural objects being in a public domain and being accessible for everyone. And this is actually the mission of museums as well, somehow. But the reality is that we still have these imperial museums, which were founded 100 years ago. Even some of them are even older, and unfortunately, not in all of them, but in some, and especially when we talk about Berlin, there is still a very conservative mindset in those museums, how they deal and treat the collection. So you can actually tell that how they treat the physical objects, they try to apply the same restrictions to the digital objects, which rationally doesn't really make sense, because you can share digital objects with the whole world. But it gives you a broad audience, a different world. And I think it's only a matter of time when museums are going to change their stand towards digital objects. But it needs a discussion, and it won't be just a decision internally, I guess. But they need some more either inspiration or pressure from the public. The main motivation of museums not opening their collections is because they want to cling to their role as gatekeepers, and they want to have the last word on the objects. They want to give meaning to the objects and tell the story about the object. And that is what is really problematic when we talk especially about material objects from other cultures, where cultures completely feel misrepresented.
For us, and therefore we do also provenance research on our collections, even they came in the 19th, early 20th century, we have to check if they really came following regulations, the legal regulations. We just gave back objects to Alaska because there was a cooperation of indigenous tribes. They did for 2 years research on the collections which we have, several hundred pieces in the Ethnographical Museum. And after 2 years they say, okay, we want to have all the information, and therefore we are doing this research together. Which objects do you have? What are the records, the documents connected with these objects? But then we found out together that there are about a dozen of objects which came from a cemetery, which was connected to an indigenous settlement. And of course, at that time, it was forbidden, even in the 1880s, it was forbidden to excavate graves, to take out objects from graves of living populations. And then when we learned about that, we immediately say, okay, this is something we have to give back. So there are always cases which at that time, even in the 19th century, are illegal, and these things we have to restitute, and we restituted it. But all the others are out of question, that have been legally collected, and they are here now.
Many of the big Western museums have been sued by the countries of origin. Some complied voluntarily, while others have been compelled by the courts to repatriate hundreds of artifacts. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City has lost major lawsuits against the governments of Turkey and Italy, resulting in the return of artifacts valued at hundreds of millions of dollars.
Nevertheless, we have these objects here legally. I think we have two strong obligations. One, to make open the context, the provenance research and the context, how these objects came to our collections. And the second point is, even though things came legally at that time, we have an obligation to support the countries of origin. Not only to cooperate with them, but also support them. I mean, there is now in Egypt, in Minya, in Middle Egypt, the city, the modern city, which is very close to Amarna, where Nefertiti has been excavated. Excavation later, after the First World War, went on by Egyptian archaeologists, American archaeologists, and before the Arabic Spring, they finished a museum building. The museum is finished, but there's no exhibition. And my thinking is that Germany should help the Egyptians really to finish the whole museum, to make possible really, and if it's only by providing them with vitrines and whatever, and really to help them in making work a museum in Middle Egypt. Middle Egypt is an area in Egypt which is not very healthy because all the tourism goes to Upper Egypt or Lower Egypt, but less to Middle Egypt. So it would be extremely important for this region really to create jobs as museum guides, restaurants, souvenir shops and whatever. So this is only one example, and there are many others how the countries in the West or in the Northern Hemisphere which have this collection can support them, and I think this obligation is very important.
They're now doing the art and museum in Minya, and they asked the German ministry if they would loan the bust, and the German ministry refused. So they are going to create an empty box for Nefertiti that will always remain in the museum, saying that the queen of Akhenaten is in Berlin. So even if she stays in Berlin, the Egyptians in a way have reacquired it emotionally, and they reappropriated it in the modern times.
I'm one to be very critical of many museums, including our own British Museum, because I feel museums should have a public role. I do agree that they should have some kind of public role in engaging and being something that's open, accessible for knowledge and information. However, that's not the case. If I want to apply for the British Museum, or Pergamon's even worse in some cases, to do some kind of understand, or even see the object and work with it, it's not that easy of a process, actually, and often you're just rejected. So it means that we don't actually we have not this, what they say, the authorities often is not true. They are not necessarily open to the public, and they're not certainly even open necessarily to researchers who are interested in using or studying these objects as a way to understanding the past. So I do have lots of sympathy to countries that want their objects back. I think things have changed. I mean, I understand in one sense that these museums, their identities were created around these famous objects. So I understand that there's some benefit to having different objects from around the world in one place. But we also live in a different age, and people have, power is no longer centered in a few cities around the world, or at least we'd like to think so. Obviously, it's not necessarily always the case. But at least on some level, I think we should try to give a little more authority about in regards to people's heritage. So if economic and political power may rest in a few places, at least power of heritage should reside in every place. Basically, everyone should have a voice, as far as I'm concerned. So it's a very tricky debate in some sense too, because when these agreements were done, like in the case of the Elgin marbles or other objects from Iraq, for instance, there were very different authorities in power at that time. Some of these countries did not even exist. So how do you define who has the right? But at the same time, I think those people who have the locals who are now in those countries who want some of those objects back also have a right to ask for these things. So I think it's something we need to discuss, and the implications of those decisions should be done in a kind of a clear manner. At the very least, museums need to become much more transparent, in my opinion, that they do have a potential useful function in modern society, but they have to engage much more with the public and with researchers, in my opinion, to make those objects that they have more accessible and useful from a scientific point of view. Because even the basic thing that they say, that they're kind of purveyors and holders of knowledge from the past around the world, that's not even true, because in many cases they don't give us access. So if you don't have access, then you're not really doing your job, are you?
Create now in the 21st century, or even in the late 20th century, a universal museums like we have it in Berlin, London, Paris, Petersburg, or New York is not anymore possible. We have such places in the world. I mean, look to China. They're creating, I don't know how many museums, huge museums every year. Look to the Gulf region, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and so on, Qatar. Money is not the problem, but it's not anymore so easy to acquire these collections, because each country has now legal regulations that are much more stricter than 100 years ago or 150 years ago. Or 150 years ago, many countries did not even have legal regulation about the export of cultural heritage and antiquities.
Look at the Persian Gulf. They're building these monuments. In fact, there is a Louvre now in the Persian Gulf, a Louvre museum, Abu Dhabi. They just got in hot water very recently. The Iraqi authorities were accusing them of having smuggled objects from Iraq now being displayed in Abu Dhabi's museum. And we've been saying that the Gulf is a place to watch out for, because they are building these grand museums. There are lots of private collections down there. And they certainly could be potential people who might be buying some of these objects. So we assume it's the West, but we shouldn't always make that assumption. There are other people who have money out there who may be buying these objects. So I think it is possible in a sense, but it won't be done in a legal way. I mean, there are lots of laws now. Pretty much every country on the planet has a law against protecting its heritage. So doing it legally is impossible. Doing it illegally seems to certainly be possible.
So there's, of course, an enormous illegal market, which is the huge problem, illegal or illicit trafficking of antiquities. All these things which the so-called Islamic State took out from Syria and Iraq, and not only Islamic State. I mean, this was always a problem in the Near East, and not only in the Near East. I mean, look to South America. There's a huge international mafia of illegal excavations and these golden items to make trade all over the world. But no public museum really can anymore acquire such things if they are illegal. So it's not anymore possible.
And maybe also there should be a discourse that provides not institutions, but just regular citizens from Egypt and from Germany or London discussing, this is ours, no, this is ours. This is part of our identity. How can we meet halfway? How can we have this shared piece of history that's part of, maybe now Nefertiti is part of Berlin's identity, but it's also part of Tell Amarna's identity in Minya. So maybe we can bring Berliners and Minyawis and get them to engage in a meaningful discourse. Maybe then the people would really affect both institutions to find a solution that makes, maybe Nefertiti would fly 6 months in Berlin, 6 months in Minya, or I think people are evolving, and our ideas about cultural heritage are evolving as well. And I believe that instead of always fighting that this is ours, no, this is ours, I think we should meet, because this problem was done by all the people who created this problem are dead now. We are left with a heritage as well that's not easy. So maybe we also need to create a discourse from the people and not necessarily by the institutions. Because I think the current institution in Egypt and the current institution in Germany, they will never be able to form a meaningful discourse on the subject.